The fluorescent lights of Sterling Grove Retirement Community's main hall buzzed with artificial warmth as Robert Chun stood before the administrative review board, his weathered hands gripping a manila folder containing 30 years of meticulously kept records, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his fingers. Had just finished explaining why the sudden tripling of his monthly care fees that now consumed his entire pension, the written agreement he'd signed when he moved in 5 years ago. Mr. Chun, Director Patricia Aldridge interrupted, not bothering to look up from a phone. We've modernized our billing structure. If you're unhappy with Sterling Grove's premium services, perhaps a more affordable facility would suit your needs better. The 3 board members behind the table smirked. One was texting. Another examined her manicured nails. The security guard by the door shifted his weight, already anticipating the elderly man's forced exit. Robert's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He'd learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant knowing when words were wasted. He simply nodded once, collected his folder, and turned toward the door. No one noticed the man in the worn cardigan sitting in the back corner of the room. He'd been there the entire hearing, a forgotten observer among forgotten people, his presence as unremarkable as the beige wallpaper. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago. His newspaper remained unread in his lap, but his eyes had recorded everything. No one in that room noticed the man sitting quietly in the corner. And that was their biggest mistake. If you're drawn to stories where the truth hides in plain sight, subscribe now, because who that man really is, and what he does next, only makes sense at the very end. As Robert walked down the corridor toward his small apartment, his pace measured and controlled, the man in the cardigan remained seated. He watched through the glass partition as Director Aldridge and her board erupted in laughter the moment the hearing room door closed. Did you see his face? One board member cackled, like we're supposed to care about some contract from 2020. These people don't understand basic economics, Patricia added, sliding her phone across the table to show something to her colleagues. If they can't afford it, they shouldn't be here. Simple as that. The man in the corner carefully folded his newspaper. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of slowness people mistake for frailty rather than patience. He stood, leaving exact change for his coffee on the small side table, and walked toward the exit with the same unremarkable gait he'd maintained all morning. The receptionist didn't look up as he passed. The security guard held the door open with mechanical politeness, already forgetting his face. Outside, a black Mercedes idled in the visitor parking lot. The driver straightened when he saw the man approaching, but was waved off with a subtle gesture. Not yet. The man in the cardigan paused beside a bench near the entrance, watching as Robert Chun appeared on a second-floor balcony, standing alone, staring out at a city that seemed to have stopped seeing him years ago. What none of them knew what they could untab known was that the forgotten man in the worn cardigan had built the very building they stood in, and 16 others like it across 3 states. But that revelation was still hours away. For now, he simply watched, and remembered everything. Robert Chun had learned to measure his life in small rituals. Every morning, at 6:47 a.m., he would wake without an alarm dress, in one of his 3 identical cardigans, navy blue, carefully maintained purchase from a clearance rack in 2019, and walk to the communal kitchen on the 2nd floor of Sterling Grove. The elevator was faster, but Robert preferred the stairs. 16 steps up, a landing, 16 more. His knees protested less than they had a year ago, a small victory he celebrated in silence. The kitchen was always empty at this hour. Robert appreciated empty spaces. They asked nothing of him. He would make instant coffee, the chibi kind that came in bulk from the supply closet, and sit by the western window, watching the city of Portland emerge from darkness. From this height, the bridges he'd helped design 30 years ago were visible as faint lines across the Willamette River. The Morrison Bridge, the Hawthorne. Structures that would outlive him by centuries. Monuments to a man no one here knew he'd been. On his small table, always in the same arrangement, the coffee cup, a folded newspaper he'd retrieved from the recycling bin the day before, and a silver-framed photograph of his wife, Linda, taken in 1987 at the opening ceremony of his first major project. She was laughing, her hand on his chest, her eyes reflecting pride that made his chest ache, even now, 5 years after her death. He never spoke about her to anyone at Sterling Grove. What would be the point? These people saw him as he appeared, a quiet, aging Chinese man who kept to himself, who smiled politely but never engaged, who existed in the margins of a facility designed to warehouse people society had finished using. Robert had made peace with invisibility. It was safer than being seen. The other residents of Sterling Grove occupied similar margins, each trapped in their own version of a Margaret Holloway in 3C, a former professor of literature, now spent her days arguing with her daughter over video calls about money she didn't have. David Romo-Sintoef, who'd worked 40 years as a postal carrier, sat in the common room watching game shows with the volume too loud, filling silence with noise because silence reminded him he was alone. There were 38 residents in total. Robert knew all their names, their routines, their quiet desperations. He noticed things. It was an old habit from his engineering, these observing patterns, identifying structural weaknesses, understanding systems. Sterling Grove Retirement Community was a system with many weaknesses. The building itself was structurally sound. Robert had verified this within his first week of residency, but the cracks weren't in the concrete. They were in how the place was managed, how residents were treated, how dignity was stripped away through 1,000 small indignities disguised as policy. The morning meetings, where Director Patricia Aldridge spoke to them like children. The wellness checks that felt like surveillance. The ever-expanding list of fees for services that used to be included. The way staff members stopped learning residents' names, referring to them instead by room numbers or dietary restrictions. The diabetic in 2B needs his medication. 3C is complaining about the thermostat again. Tell 1A he can't leave his newspaper in the common area. Robert had documented it all. Not out of anger was a luxury he'd abandoned but out of habit. Engineers documented TMS. They recorded data and analyzed patterns. In a locked drawer in his small apartment, he kept a series of notebooks filled with dates, times, observations, staff shift changes, maintenance requests ignored, promised repairs never completed, financial discrepancies between what was charged and what was delivered. He didn't know yet what he would do with this information. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps he was simply creating the illusion of control in a life where he controlled almost nothing. But he kept writing. Every day. Small, precise notes in his careful handwriting. It was during one of these morning rituals, on a Tuesday in late September, that Robert first noticed the man in the worn cardigan. The man appeared in the common area around 9 a.m., settling into a chair in the far corner, with a newspaper and a cup of coffee from the machine that dispensed liquid barely qualified as coffee. He was perhaps in his late 60s, with silver hair that needed cutting, and a face that seemed designed to be forgotten the moment you looked away from it. His cardigan was expensive. Once Robert could tell quality even when it was faded boot. Now it hung loose on his frame, buttons mismatched, one elbow patched with brown fabric that didn't quite match the original gray. Robert noticed him because the man did what Robert did. He watched. While other visitors came to Sterling Grove with purpose, adults, children, fulfilling obligations, social workers checking boxers, salespeople hunting for vulnerable signatures, this man simply sat. He never spoke to residents, never approached staff. He read his paper with the attention of someone who'd already read it twice, and he watched the room with eyes that missed nothing. Robert recognized a fellow observer. Over the following weeks, the man became a fixture. He appeared 3, sometimes 4 times a week, always in the same chair, always with the same patient stillness. Staff walked past him without acknowledgement. Other residents assumed he was someone's visiting family member, too polite or too indifferent to ask. But Robert noticed patterns. The man appeared on days when administrative meetings were scheduled. He was present during facility inspections. He happened to be in the dining hall when the food service director was explaining new portion controls to reduce costs. His coffee cup became a prop, refilled but never drunk, giving him permission to occupy space without explanation. Robert considered introducing himself once, but decided against it. Some observers didn't want to be observing. Instead, he simply noted the man's presence in his documentation. Regular visitor, unknown affiliation, interested observer. And then he went back to his own quiet recording of Sterling Grove's systematic failures. Neither man knew that their parallel observations were creating a record that would soon matter very much. Neither man knew that within weeks, their silence would become the loudest voice in the room. The morning of the Administrative Review Board hearing, Robert woke at 6:47 a.m. As always, he made his coffee, as always. He sat by his window, as always, watching the bridges emerge from morning fog. But this morning, he also reviewed his folder one final time. 30 years of training had taught him to trust numbers, documentation, evidence. He had all 3. What he didn't have was faith that any of it would matter to people who had already decided he didn't net. Still, he would speak. Not because he believed he would be heard, but because remaining silent felt like erasing himself before anyone else could. He finished his coffee, straightened his cardigan, picked up his manila folder, and went downstairs to be dismissed by people who would never know what they were dismissing. In the back corner of the hearing room, a man in a worn cardigan was already seated, newspaper unopened in his lap, coffee untouched, watching, recording, waiting Robert. 3 days after the hearing, Robert established a new routine within his routine. Every afternoon at 2 p.m., he would walk the corridors of Sterling Grove's 3 residential floors. A circuit that took exactly 18 minutes if he maintained his steady pace. He told himself it was exercise, doctor's orders for his circulation. But the truth was simpler. He was checking on people who had no one else checking on them. Margaret Holloway had stopped answering her daughter's calls. Robert noticed because her door stayed closed now, whereas before she'd always left it cracked open, hungry for any sound of human presence. He began knocking softly each afternoon, asking if she needed anything from the kitchen. She always said no, but she would stand in a doorway and talk for exactly 4 minutes before exhausting her capacity for interaction. Robert timed it. 4 minutes of dignity, of being treated like her words mattered. David Ramos had started forgetting to eat. Robert noticed because David's usual spot in the dining hall sat empty during meal. So Robert began appearing at David's door at 5:45 p.m., mentioning casually that he was heading to dinner, and the walk was easier with company. David always agreed, grateful for the fiction that he was doing Robert a favor rather than receiving one. Small interventions. Invisible kindness. The kind that left no record, but kept people tethered to the world by threads so thin they barely registered as connections. It was during one of these walks, on a Thursday afternoon heavy with October rain, that Robert heard the sound. A gasp. Sharp and wet, followed by the hollow thud of something heavy hitting carpet. He was on the 3rd floor, near the eastern stairwell. The sound came from around the corner. Near room 3G. Robert moved quickly, his engineer's mind already calculating impact velocity, body mass, potential injury severity. Walter Kovac lay crumpled in the hallway, one hand clutching his chest, the other stretched toward the wall he'd tried to catch himself against. He was 79, a retired machinist from Milwaukee, a man who Robert knew took blood thinners and had a pacemaker installed in 2023. Walter's lips were blue. His breathing came in shallow, desperate pulls. Robert dropped to his knees beside him, fingers already moving to check Walter's pulse, steady and irregular. Exactly what he feared. He turned Walter's head gently to keep his airway clear, elevated his legs using his own folded cardigan, and called out clearly, but without panic. "I need help here. Someone call 911. Medical emergency. 3rd floor, east corridor." His voice carried down the hallway. "Adore, open it. Mrs. Chun from 3D. No relation," peering out, nervously. "Call 911, Robert repeated, his tone firm enough to overcome her hesitation. "Tell them potential cardiac event. Patient is conscious but in distress. Do it now, please." She disappeared back into her apartment. Robert heard her voice, high and frightened, speaking to emergency services. He stayed with Walter, monitoring his breathing, speaking to him in low, calm tones. "You're going to be fine, Walter. Help is coming. Just keep breathing with me. In and out. That's good. You're doing great." Other doors opened. Residents emerged, forming a worried semicircle at a respectful distance. Someone brought a blanket. Someone else brought water. Robert accepted the blanket, declined the water not until paramedics cleared him. Within 6 minutes, EMTs arrived. Robert gave them a clear, concise report: patient name, approximate age, known conditions, medications, time of collapse, symptoms observed, interventions performed. The lead MT nodded approvingly. This was the kind of information that saved lives, delivered by someone who understood what mattered. They stabilized Walter, loaded him onto a gurney. As they wheeled in toward the elevator, Walter's hand shot out, grabbing Robert's wrist with surprising strength. "Thank you," he whispered. You stayed." Robert squeezed his hand gently. "Of course I stayed, Walter." The EMTs took him away. The small crowd of residents dispersed slowly, murmuring among themselves. Robert retrieved his cardigan from the floor, now wrinkled and spotted with rain from Walter's clothes, and began folding it carefully. That's when Patricia Aldrich appeared. She walked with the brisk, irritated pace of someone whose schedule had been interrupted, her heels clicking against the linoleum like a countdown. Behind her, 2 staff members followed. Marcus, the security guard who spent most shifts watching videos on his phone, and Jennifer, the administrative assistant whose primary skills seemed to be weaponized bureaucracy. "Mr. Chun," Patricia said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false patience that preceded reprimand. "What happened here?" Robert looked up from his folding. Walter Kovac had what appeared to be a cardiac episode. "I stayed with him until the paramedics arrived, I see." Patricia glanced at the lingering residents still hovering in doorways. "And you felt qualified to make that assessment?" The question landed like a slap disguised as inquiry. "I felt qualified to call for help and ensure he wasn't alone while experiencing a medical crisis. Robert replied evenly. Patricia's smile sharpened. Mr. Chun, Sterling Grove has protocols for medical emergencies. Staff members are trained in first response. Residents are not to intervene in such situations. You could have made things worse. You could have exposed yourself and this facility to liability. The hallway went quiet. Robert could feel eyes on him, residents watching from cracked doors, measuring his response, wondering if he would push back or accept this redefinition of basic human decency as a policy violation. Walter was alone in a hallway, unable to breathe properly, Robert said. His voice still calm but with an edge now, a hint of the steel that had once commanded construction sites and engineering teams. I didn't intervene in a medical emergency. I stayed with another human being who was suffering. There's a difference. Is there? Patricia tilted her head, her expression conveying that she found his distinction tiresome. Because from where I'm standing, you created a scene. Look at these residents upset. Protocols bypassed, emergency services called without proper authorization from staff. I wasn't aware. I needed authorization to call 911 for someone having a heart attack. You need to follow proper channels, Mr. Chun. This facility has procedures. If you had simply notified a staff member instead of taking matters into your own hands. There was no staff member in this corridor, Robert interrupted quietly. There rarely is. Patricia's jaw tightened. This was the problem with Robert Chun. He was too calm, too precise, too difficult to rattle. She preferred residents who either raged or collapsed. Rage could be labeled as behavioral issues. Collapse could be labeled as decline. But this quiet, persistent rationality was harder to weaponize. Regardless, she continued, your actions today were inappropriate. You've disturbed other residents, created unnecessary panic, and overstepped boundaries clearly outlined in your residency agreement. I'm issuing you a formal warning for violation of community conduct standards. Robert stared at her. A warning for helping someone who was dying. A warning for creating a disruptive environment and failing to follow established protocols. Patricia, she nodded to Jennifer, who produced a printed form already prepared. Robert noted, already filled out except for his signature line. They planned this confrontation before arriving. You'll need to sign this acknowledgement. Jennifer sighed, extending the paper and a pen. Robert took the form, read it carefully. The language was bureaucratic, designed to obscure rather than clarify, but the intent was clear. By signing, he would accept that his actions were inappropriate, that he had created a disturbance, that future incidents of this nature could result in termination of his residency. He looked up at Patricia. And if I don't sign, her smile was almost triumphant. Then we'll be forced to escalate this to the board for a formal review of your continued suitability for residence at Sterling Grove. I'd hate for it to come to that, Mr. Chun. These reviews rarely end well for the resident in question. The threat hung in the air, unsubtle and effective. Robert had already been through one board review. He knew how it worked. A panel of people who saw residents as problems to be managed, expenses to be minimized, complaints to be silenced. He could fight this. He could refuse to sign, demand his own review, bring his documentation of every violation Sterling Grove committed daily. But Walter Kovac was in an ambulance, possibly dying, and Robert had stayed with him. That mattered more than this paper, more than Patricia's petty tyranny, more than winning an argument in a hallway. He signed. Patricia took the form with visible satisfaction. Thank you for your cooperation. Let's hope we don't have any more incidents. She walked away, her staff trailing behind her like an entourage. The residents who'd been watching retreated into their apartments, doors closing with soft clicks of defeat. Robert stood alone in the hallway, still holding his damp, wrinkled cardigan, and in the window at the far end of the corridor, barely visible in the reflection, a man in a worn grey cardigan stood watching, a newspaper folded under his arm. He'd seen everything. He'd recorded everything. And he was beginning to understand that Sterling Grove's cruelty wasn't exceptional, it was systematic. The warning should have silenced Robert Chun. That was its purpose to establish fear, to remind him of his precarious position, to teach him that compassion had consequences in places where efficiency mattered more than humanity. Instead, something shifted. The day after signing the form, Robert appeared at the monthly budget meeting held in Sterling Grove's small conference room. These meetings were technically open to residents, a detail buried in page 47 of the residency handbook that no one read. In 3 years, no resident had ever attended. Until now. Robert arrived 5 minutes early, took a seat in the back corner, and sat with perfect stillness, a notebook and pen resting on his lap. Patricia Aldrich made conversation with the facility's accountant, stopped mid-sentence, When she noticed him, "Mr. Chun," she said, her voice carrying forced pleasantness. "Can we help you with something?" "No, thank you. I'm just observing. These meetings are open to residents, correct?" Patricia's smile tightened. "They are, technically, yes. Though most residents find the content rather dry." "I don't mind dry," Robert replied, his expression perfectly neutral. She couldn't ask him to leave without violating the policy she'd written herself. So the meeting proceeded with Robert Chun sitting silently in the corner, taking occasional notes, never speaking, never asking questions, just watching. He attended the next meeting, and the one after that. He began appearing at facility tours for prospective residents, sitting quietly in the common areas where tours passed through, present but not participating. When tour guides spoke about Sterling Grove's exceptional care standards and family-like atmosphere, Robert would simply sit there, reading his newspaper, his very presence a silent counter-narrative. He started eating meals in the dining hall at different times each day, breaking his established routine, appearing when staff least expected him. He would sit alone, eating slowly, observing how meals were prepared, how portions were measured, how expired food was relabeled rather than discarded, and he took photographs. His phone was a Shanta model from 2019, with a cracked screen and a camera that barely functioned, but it functioned well enough. He photographed broken handrails that had been marked for repair 6 months ago, exposed wiring in the basement laundry room, mold growing behind the vending machines, fire exits blocked by storage containers, medication carts left unlocked in empty hallways. Never obviously, never with flash, just quiet documentation, one image at a time, building a record of negligence so comprehensive it would be impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The staff noticed his new patterns but couldn't quite articulate what was wrong. He wasn't violating any rules. He wasn't causing disturbances. He was simply present everywhere, watching everything. It unnerved them. He's always there," Jennifer complained to Patricia during a staff meeting, at the budget reviews, during tours, in the hallways. "It's like he's conducting surveillance. He's an elderly man with too much time on his hands," Patricia replied, though her tone carried less certainty than her words. "Ignore him. He'll get bored eventually." But Robert didn't get bored. Instead, he expanded his scope. He began having conversations with the facility's lower-tier staff, the people Patricia rarely noticed. Maria, who cleaned the floors at 5 a.m. before residents woke. James, the maintenance technician who'd worked at Sterling Grove for 15 years. Carol, who managed the kitchen on a budget so restrictive she'd learned to make chicken last 3 meals through creative relabeling. Robert spoke to them with genuine interest, asking questions about their work, their challenges, their observations. He learned that Maria had reported water damage in the West Wing 8 times, only to be told it was cosmetic. He learned that James kept a personal log of all the repair requests that were marked, completed in the system but never actually performed. He learned that Carol had been ordered to reduce meat portions by 30%, while menu prices to residents increased. He didn't ask them to do anything. He simply listened, and occasionally, very carefully, he would mention that if they ever wanted to share documentation, work orders, emails, schedules, he would be interested to see them. For his own understanding, no pressure. James was the first to bring him something. It happened on a Tuesday evening. James knocked on Robert's door, glanced down the hallway to ensure they were alone, and handed over a flash drive. 15 years of work orders, James said quietly. Everything I was told to fix. Everything I actually fixed. Everything that got marked complete in the system but never got done. I don't know what you're doing, Mr. Chun, but I've been watching you watch them, and I think maybe you're doing something that matters. Robert accepted the drive with both hands, a gesture of respect. Thank you, James. This does matter. Are you going to sue them? I don't know yet, Robert admitted. I'm still gathering information. James nodded slowly. My daughter, she's in college. I can't afford to lose this job. But I also couldn't keep watching them lie to people who trusted this place to take care of them. No one will know this came from you, Robert promised. You have my word. After James left, Robert sat at his small desk and began cross-referencing the work order data with his own observations. The patterns were damning. Systematic negligence. Documented safety violations ignored. Money charged for services never rendered. But he needed more. Over the following weeks, Maria brought him photographs of water damage that had spread from cosmetic to structural. Carol provided purchasing records showing the discrepancy between food costs and menu prices. Even Marcus, the usually indifferent security guard, mentioned casually that the facility's security cameras had been broken for 9 months, but still used as props to make residents feel monitored and controlled. Robert compiled it all, organized it, created spreadsheets and timelines, and cross-referenced documentation with the precision of Zomne. Woody spent a lifetime building things that couldn't afford to have weak foundations. He worked mostly at night. When the facility was quiet, his apartment light would glow softly until 2 or 3 a.m., visible from the parking lot below. And sometimes, on those nights, a black Mercedes would be parked in the visitor section, engine off, a figure barely visible in the driver's seat, watching the light, waiting. The man in the worn cardigan had also changed his patterns. He now appeared at Sterling Grove almost daily, but his presence had become even more ghost-like. He'd discovered that if he arrived during shift, Chinese windows when departing staff briefed arriving staff, he could move through the building almost completely unnoticed. He sat in on the same meetings as Robert, though always on the opposite side of the room. He observed the same tours, he witnessed the same casual cruelties that Robert documented, but unlike Robert, he asked different questions. He spoke to the accountant after one budget meeting, asking seemingly naive questions about corporate structure. "I'm thinking of moving my mother here," he'd said, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone unfamiliar with such facilities. "But I like to understand how these places are run, who actually owns Sterling Grove." The accountant, eager to appear knowledgeable, explained the complex web of holding companies and property management firms, never noticing how the old man's eyes sharpened with each piece of information. He befriended the receptionist by bringing her coffee from the good cafe across the street, gradually learning the names of board members, the schedule of corporate visits, the hierarchy of decision-making that kept Patricia Aldridge insulated from accountability. He was building his own map of Sterling Grove's infrastructure, not the physical building, but the power structure that allowed places like this to function as profit centers disguised as care facilities. One evening, Robert and the man in the cardigan found themselves alone in the common area. It was late, past 9 p.m. Most residents were in their rooms. The night staff was distracted with medication rounds. The man looked up from his newspaper. Same newspaper he'd been pretending to read for weeks. Robert looked up from his notebook. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Two observers, recognizing each other across the room. Then the man gave the smallest nod. Not greeting, not acknowledgement of acquaintance. Recognition? Robert returned the nod. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They both went back to their work, Robert to his documentation, the man to his newspaper. But something had shifted. Two parallel investigations had just acknowledged each other's existence. Neither man knew yet how their separate efforts would converge. Neither man knew that they were both working toward the same moment of reckoning, approaching it from different directions. The man in the cardigan left at 9:30, as he always did. The black Mercedes was waiting. This time, though he didn't wave off his driver, he climbed into the back seat, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "It's me," he said quietly. "I need you to pull everything on a Sterling Grove retirement community in Portland. Corporate structure, ownership chain, management contracts, financial statements for the last 5 years. And do it quietly. No one can know we're looking." A pause. "Because I think we have a problem, and I think we're about to have a much bigger one if we do unfix it before someone else exposes it." He hung up, looked back at the building, at the lights still glowing in Robert Chun's third-floor window. "Keep working," he murmured to himself. "Keep building your case. You're going to need it to be airtight." And in his apartment, Robert Chun was thinking the same thing, cross-referencing his latest data, knowing he was close to having enough evidence to act, not knowing that the man who could help him most was already working on his behalf, not knowing that justice was being built from two directions at once. James Mercer had worked in building maintenance for 23 years. 15 of those years had been spent at Sterling Grove, watching the facility slowly deteriorate from a place that genuinely cared about its residents into something else entirely, something that wore the mask of care while hollowing out everything beneath it. He was 41, a father of 2, and carried the particular exhaustion of a man who saw problems every day that he was unallowed to fix. His daughter Emma was a sophomore at Portland State, studying civil engineering. His son Marcus, named after his grandfather, not the useless security guard, was in high school, already talking about college. James needed this job. The benefits were decent, the pay was steady, and in an economy where maintenance positions were increasingly replaced by contractors who charged triple and delivered half, stability mattered. But stability had a cost. Every time he marked a work order complete when it wasn't. Every time he told a resident he'd come back to fix something, knowing that repair would never be approved. Every time he watched Patricia Aldred store prospective families through freshly painted corridors, while the West Wing slowly rotted behind walls, he felt the cost accumulating like debt against his conscience. Then Robert Toon started paying attention. At first, James had dismissed him as just another resident with too much time and too many complaints. Sterling Grove attracted that type people who'd spent their professional lives in positions of authority, now struggling with the indignity of being managed rather than managing. But Robert was different. He didn't complain. He asked questions. Specific, technical questions that revealed an understanding of building systems that most residents didn't possess. James, Robert had said one afternoon, catching him in the stairwell, "I noticed the ventilation in the East Wing seems inadequate. The air feels stale, and several residents have developed respiratory issues. Has the HVAC system been serviced recently? Not the air smells bad or fix the air, but a precise observation connected to a specific system, asked by someone who understood how buildings worked. It's scheduled for next month." James had replied automatically, the lie so practiced it came out smooth. Robert had simply nodded, made a note in his small notebook, and continued on his way. But the question lingered, because Robert was right, the HVAC system hadn't been properly serviced in 18 months, despite quarterly maintenance being required by state health codes, and residents had been getting sick. Then came the incident with Walter Cole. James had been in the basement when it happened, replacing a blown circuit breaker that had been temporarily bypassed for 6 months. He'd heard about it later from Maria Howe. Robert had stayed with Walter Howe. He'd known exactly what information to give the paramedics. How Patricia had reprimanded him for basic human decency. That's when James started paying closer attention to Robert Toon. He noticed the older man's new patterns. The meeting attenders. The quiet documentation. The way Robert had begun asking staff members careful, respectful questions about their work. And he noticed something else. There was another man, someone James had seen around the facility for months, but never really registered. An older guy in a gray cardigan who seemed to blend into the furniture, always reading the same newspaper, always nursing the same cup of terrible coffee. James wouldn't have connected them, Robert and the cardigan man, except for one detail. They asked the same questions. Not identical questions, but questions that probed the same structural concerns from different angles. Robert would ask about HVAC maintenance schedules. The cardigan man would casually mention to the accountant that he was curious about utility costs. Robert would photograph water damage in the West Wing. The cardigan man would ask the property manager during one of his rare visits about insurance claims for water damage. Robert documented safety violations. The cardigan man asked questions about liability coverage. It was like watching two people conduct the same investigation using different methods, and neither seemed aware of what the other was doing. James couldn't figure out the cardigan man's angle. He wasn't a resident. He wasn't family of a resida, James had checked. He wasn't a state inspector. Those came with badges and attitudes. He was just there, a fixture so unremarkable that even Patricia, who noticed everything that could be controlled, seemed to have stopped seeing him. But James saw him, and James saw that he was documenting Sterling Grove just as methodically as Robert Toon, just from a different perspective. It bothered him, not because he objected to the investigation. God knows Sterling Grove deserved to be investigated, but because he couldn't understand the endgame. What were they planning to do with all this information? The question gnawed at him until one evening in late October, when he found himself knocking on Robert's door after his shift ended. Robert answered promptly, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this conversation. "James," he said warmly, "come in." The apartment was small but meticulously organized. A kitchenette, a sitting area, a bedroom visible through a half-open door. On the desk by the window, stacks of papers, a laptop that looked older than some of James's tools, and multiple flash drives labeled with dates. "I've been wondering when you'd come by," Robert said, gesturing to the small table. "Coffee. It's better than what they serve downstairs, I promise." James sat, accepted the coffee, and asked the question that had been building for weeks. "What are you doing, Mr. Toon?" "All the documentation, the photographs, the questions. What's the point?" "Are you building a lawsuit? Because if you are, you should know that Patricia has lawyers, good ones, and they'll bury you in motions and delays until you run out of money or energy or both." Robert settled into the chair across from him, cradling his own coffee cup. "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "Initially, I was just documenting for my own understanding. I'm an engineer by training, James. When I see a failing system, I can't help but analyze it. But the more I documented, the more I realized this isn't just poor management. It's systematic negligence designed to maximize profit while minimizing care. And that's not just wrong, it's criminal." "So you're planning to sue Maybe I'll take it to the state licensing board. Or the media. I haven't decided because I'm still gathering evidence. I need the case to be airtight. No room for them to dismiss it as the complaints of one disgruntled resident. James set down his coffee. You know the other guy is doing the same thing, right? Robert's expression shifted, subtle surprise quickly masked. Other guy? The one in the gray cardigan. Always reading the newspaper. He's been here for months, asking questions, observing, different questions than yours, but aimed at the same target. You've seen him? I've noticed him, Robert acknowledged carefully. But I assumed he was just a visitor. Family of a resident, perhaps. He's not, I asked around. No one knows who he is or who he's visiting. But he's definitely investigating Sterling Grove. And here's the thing that bothers me. He asks questions about ownership structure, corporate hierarchy, financial liability chains. That's not resident-level curiosity. That's someone who understands how companies work and is mapping out responsibility. Robert leaned back, processing this. You think he's a lawyer? Or a journalist? Or maybe corporate intelligence, someone hired by a competitor to expose problems. James paused. Or maybe someone from the company that actually owns this place, checking to see how badly their property is being managed. That last possibility hung in the air between them. If he's from corporate, Robert said slowly, then they already know there are problems. Which means either they don't care, or they're waiting for it to become public before they act. Or, James offered, he's doing the same thing you are. Gathering evidence, building a case, maybe waiting for the right moment to drop it all at once. Robert stood, walked to his desk, picked up one of the flash drives. The work orders you gave me, they're damning, James. 15 years of documented negligence. Repairs promised, but never completed. Safety violations ignored. If combined with my documentation, with testimony from staff who've witnessed this systematic failure, you'd have enough to shut this place down. James finished or forced a complete management overhaul. But that's my point, Mr. Chun. What happens to the residents if you shut Sterling Grove down? Where do they go? What happens to the staff who are just following orders? I've got 2 kids in school and a mortgage. Maria supporting her mother in Guatemala. Carol's got medical bills from her husband's cancer treatment. I know. Robert's voice was quiet. I've thought about that, which is why I haven't acted yet. The goal isn't destruction. It's accountability. Change. A system that actually protects the people it claims to serve. James stood, moved to the window, looked down at the parking lot, where a black Mercedes sat in the visitors section again. It was there most nights now. That car, he said. It's always here when you're working late. You notice it? Robert joined him at the window. I've seen it. You think it's him? The cardigan guy? I don't know, but whoever it is, they're patient, they're methodical, and they're watching. They stood together in silence, 2 men who'd stumbled into an alliance neither had planned, staring down at a car that represented questions neither could answer. Finally, James spoke. Mr. Chun, I gave you that flash drive because I think what you're doing matters. But I need to know when you make your move. Whatever it is, will there be protections for the staff who helped you? Because if this blows up and we all just lose our jobs without anything changing, then what's the point? Robert turned to face him directly. James, I give you my word. Whatever action I take, I will do everything in my power to protect the people who trusted me with the truth. You, Maria, Carrillo, not the problem. You're the solution. The evidence you've provided proves that the staff knew this was wrong, documented it was wrong, and tried to fix it within a broken system. That matters. James nodded slowly, wanting to believe him. There's something else, Robert continued. That cardigan man, I want to know who he is, what he's planning. Because if we're both building cases toward the same goal, maybe we're stronger together than separate. Or maybe his goals don't align with ours at all. You want me to find out who he is? Can you? James considered this. Maybe. The receptionist keeps a visitor log. It's supposed to be signed by everyone who enters. But half the time, she forgets to ask. Still, if he's been coming here for months, there might be a record, a name, something. Would you be willing to check? James thought about his daughter, studying engineering, learning to build things that would last. He thought about the 15 years he'd spent watching Sterling Grove crumble while pretending it was solid. Yeah, he said. I'll check. But Mr. Chun, if this goes wrong, if they figure out what we're doing before you're ready to act, then we all go down together. Robert finished. I understand the risk, James. And I won't ask you to take it if you're not willing. James smiled grimly. I'm already in it. Might as well see it through after it left. Robert returned to his desk and opened a new document on his laptop. He titled it simply, Allies and Unknowns. Under Allies, he listed James Mercer, Maria Santos, Carol Williams, Marcus Green tentative. Under Unknowns, he wrote, Man in Grey Cardigan. Purpose unclear. Methods professional, possible threat or possible asset. And then, because he was an engineer who believed in accounting for all variables, he added a third category. What we're missing? Because something still didn't add up. 2 separate investigations, running parallel, aimed at the same target. It felt too coincidental. Too coordinated. Unless it wasn't coincidence at all. Unless someone had known, long before Robert started documenting, that Sterling Grove was a problem waiting to explode, and that person was simply waiting for the right catalyst to light the fuse. On the first Tuesday of November, Robert Chun did something unprecedented in Sterling Grove's history. He called a residents' meeting, not an official meeting. Those required facility approval, scheduling through Patricia's office, adherence to protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of independent organization. This was something simpler and more dangerous. A gathering of people who've been isolated long enough to forget they could still gather. Rabba went door to door personally, speaking quietly to each resident who would listen. Community room, tonight at 7. Important information about our rights. Optional, but I hope you'll come. Some doors didn't open. Some residents were too afraid, too tired, too beaten down by the systematic erosion of dignity to believe anything could change. Badarzatin, in Tota Shoda, Margaret Holloway came, her literature professor's instincts recognizing the structure of a revolution in its early stages. David Ramos came, grateful for purpose, beyond game shows. Walter Kovac came, still recovering from his cardiac episode, wanting to thank the man who'd stayed with him when staff hadn't. They filled the community room with the nervous energy of people breaking rules they couldn't quite name. Robert stood before them. No podium, no presentation materials. Just a man, in a navy cardigan, holding a folder that had grown thick with evidence. Thank you for coming, he began, his voice steady and clear. I've asked you here because I believe we've all experienced the same Finja systematic pattern of care promised but not delivered. Fees increased, but services reduced. Dignity offered in brochures, but denied in practice. Heads nodded, eyes met across the room. Residents recognizing shared experiences in each other's faces. I've spent the last 3 months documenting these violations. I have evidence of safety code breaches, financial discrepancies, staff reductions that violate our contracts, maintenance failures that endanger our health. I have testimony from staff members who have been ordered to cut corners and falsify records. Margaret raised her hand. An academic habit that made several people smile despite the tension. What are you proposing we do with this information? I'm proposing we file a class action lawsuit against Sterling Grove for a breach of contract, negligent care, and elder abuse. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. I don't have a lawyer, Robert continued. I don't have funding. What I have is documentation strong enough that I believe we can find legal representation on contingency lawyers who will take the case for a percentage of any settlement because the evidence is that compelling. They'll retaliate, someone said from the back. Mrs. Chun from 3D, her voice small but certain. The moment they know we're organizing, they'll find reasons to evict us. Behavior violations, medical unsuitability. They have lawyers too. They do, Robert acknowledged. Which is why I'm not asking anyone to join this action who is unwilling to accept that risk. This is voluntary. If you want to participate, you sign a document indicating your willingness to be part of the case. If you don't, nothing changes for you. No judgment, no pressure. When? Walter asked. When would this happen? I'm meeting with a legal advocacy group next week. If they agree to take the case, we could file within a month. But I need to know tonight how many residents are willing to participate. Because if it's just me, it's not a class action, it's one old man complaining. If it's 18 of us, we're a pattern, with evidence of systematic abuse. The room fell quiet. These were people who'd spent their lives making careful decisions, weighing risks, protecting what little stability they had left. What Robert was asking them to do was fundamentally Me too. One by one, voices around the room. 14 out of 18 agreed to participate. Robert felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope, mixed with terror, the particular sensation of standing at the edge of something that couldn't be undone. Thank you, he said quietly. I'll prepare the documents. We'll do this right. We'll do this carefully. And the community room door opened. Patricia Aldrich stood in the doorway, flanked by Marcus, a security guard, and 2 people Robert didn't recognize expensive suits. Briefcases. The unmistakable aura of corporate legal defense. Mr. Chun, Patricia said, her voice dripping with false civility. What an interesting gathering. I don't recall approving a residence meeting. You didn't? Robert replied calmly. Because approval isn't required for residents to speak with each other in common spaces. It's in the residency handbook, page 62. Patricia's smile sharpened. How fortunate that you're so familiar with the handbook. Perhaps you're also familiar with page 94, which addresses organizing activities that create hostile environments or encourage litigation against the facility. I'm familiar with it. This doesn't qualify. We're discussing our rights and options. That's not hostile. That's informed decision-making. Robert, one of the lawyers, stepped forward, a woman in her 40s, with the kind of polished aggression that came from winning cases through attrition. Mr. Chun, I'm Sandra Vance, legal counsel for Meridian Properties Group, which manages Sterling Grove. We've been made aware of your recent activities. The documentation, the staff interviews, the photography. We're here to inform you that these activities constitute harassment of staff, unauthorized surveillance, and potentially defamatory evidence gathering. Robert remained standing, his posture unchanged. Everything I have documented has been in common areas or in circumstances where I had legitimate reason to observe. I've harassed no one. I've surveilled nothing that wasn't already visible. And documentation of actual violations isn't defamation, it's evidence. That'll be for a court to decide. Sandra replied smoothly. What we're here to tell you tonight is that Sterling Grove is prepared to resolve your concerns through proper channels. We're offering you the opportunity to meet with management, present your grievances through our internal review process, and reach an amicable solution. And if I decline that generous offer, Patricia stepped forward again, her mask of civility slipping slightly, then we'll be forced to initiate eviction proceedings against you for creating a disruptive environment, encouraging litigation, and violating multiple community standards. We have documentation of your behavioral violations, Mr. Chun. The warning you signed after the incident with Mr. Kovac, your unauthorized attendance at administrative meetings, your pattern of photographing facility property without permission. None of those are violations, Robert said quietly, but you'll claim they are, and you'll bury me in legal processes until I run out of money or energy or both. I understand the strategy. Then you understand your position, Sandra said. We're offering you 2 weeks to organize your departure voluntarily. We'll waive early termination fees, provide positive references for other facilities, and this matter ends quietly, or we proceed with formal eviction, which will make finding alternative placements significantly more difficult. The room had gone silent. The other residents looked at Robert with a mixture of fear, admiration, and guilt that he was facing this alone because of a fight he'd started on their behalf. Robert looked at the folder in his hands. 3 months of work, hundreds of documented violations, testimony from staff who'd risked their jobs to tell the truth, evidence of systematic elder abuse disguised as business efficiency, and he was being offered a choice. Walk away quietly, or lose everything in a legal battle he couldn't afford to fight. He looked at Margaret, at Walter, at the 14 residents who'd agreed to stand with him. Then he looked back at Patricia and her lawyers. I'll take your offer, he said. The words felt like surrender, tasted like ash in his mouth. Excellent decision, Patricia sighed, her relief visible. We'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow. On one condition, Robert continued. I want those 2 weeks to properly organize my move. No harassment, no additional fees, no interference. I leave quietly. You get what you want, a problem resident removed without public complaint. Sandra nodded. That's acceptable. We'll formalize the agreement in writing. They left, Patricia's heels clicking triumphantly down the hallway. The residents sat in stunned silence. Mr. Chun, Margaret finally said, her voice breaking. We didn't ask you to give up everything for us. Robert shook his head. I haven't given up anything yet. I just bought us 2 weeks. 2 weeks for what? Walter asked. Robert didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked toward the community room window, where a figure in a gray cardigan stood outside in the parking lot, watching. The man had witnessed the entire confrontation through the glass, and for the first time in 3 months, Robert Chun was going to find out exactly who had been watching alongside him. Because if he only had 2 weeks, he needed to know whether he was fighting alone or whether someone else had been building toward this same moment all along. In the parking lot, the man in the cardigan pulled out his phone and made a call. It's happening, he said quietly. They're forcing him out. We need to move faster than planned. A pause. 2 weeks. Maybe less. Get everything ready. He hung up, looked back at the building, at Robert Chun visible through the window. Don't give up yet, he murmured. You're not as alone as you think, The state auditors arrived on a Wednesday morning, unannounced, carrying clipboards and the kind of bureaucratic authority that couldn't be charmed or intimidated away. There were 4 of them too, from the Department of Health and Human Services, 2 from the State Licensing Board for Senior Care Facilities. They showed their credentials to a bewildered receptionist, who immediately paged Patricia Aldrich, with the kind of panic usually reserved for fires or lawsuits. Patricia appeared within 90 seconds, her professional smile already in place, though her eyes carried the calculation of someone rapidly assessing threat levels. "Gentlemen, ladies," she said smoothly, "this is unexpected. We weren't notified of a scheduled inspection." "No, you weren't," replied the lead auditor, a woman in her 50s named Catherine Moore, whose expression suggested she'd seen every variety of elder care negligence and was unimpressed by any of it. "This is a surprise complaints audit triggered by multiple anonymous complaints filed with our office over the past month. We'll need access to all resident files, maintenance records, financial documentation, and staff schedules for the past 2 years." Patricia's smile never wavered, but something behind her eyes went very still. "Of course. Though I should mention that anonymous complaints are often filed by disgruntled residents or former employees with personal grievances. We maintain the highest standards of care here at Sterling Grove. Then you'll have nothing to worry about," Catherine replied, her tone making clear that worry was exactly what Patricia should be feeling. "We'll start with the West Wing. I understand there have been concerns about water damage and structural integrity." Patricia's expression flickered, just for a moment before, resetting to professional cooperation. "I'm not aware of any structural issues, but you're welcome to inspect whatever you'd like. Marcus, please escort our visitors." But Catherine was already walking toward the West Wing corridor, her team following, leaving Patricia and Marcus to catch up. What Patricia didn't know she could have known was that the inspection team had arrived, with a very specific roadmap. Anonymous complaints, yes, but complaints so detailed, so precisely documented, that they included room numbers, dates of specific incidents, staff names, and photographic evidence of violations. Someone had handed them a comprehensive investigation on a silver platter. They found the water damage within 10 minutes, not the cosmetic staining that Maria had reported 8 times the structural rot behind. The walls that James had documented but been forbidden to repair. Catherine's team took measurements, photographs, samples. One auditor punched a pen through drywall that crumbled like wet cardboard. "How long has this been ongoing?" Catherine asked. Patricia, who had followed them, stared at the exposed wall. "This is news to me. Our maintenance staff should have reported." "Your maintenance staff did report it," interrupted another auditor, consulting his tablet. 8 separate work orders filed by Maria Santos over 18 months, all marked as cosmetic, low priority in your system. "May I see that?" Patricia reached for the tablet, but the auditor held it back. "This is state evidence now, Ms. Aldrich. You'll receive copies as part of our formal report." They moved through the building like forensic investigators at a crime scene. Every violation Robert had photographed, they found. Every safety code breach he documented. Every maintenance failure James had logged, they confirmed. The fire exits blocked by storage found and photographed. The exposed wiring in the laundry room found and documented as an immediate safety hazard. The expired medications relabeled with false dates in the dispensary found and confiscated as evidence. The HVAC system that had been serviced in 18 months, despite quarterly requirements confirmed through inspection of filters clogged with mold. By noon, Patricia's professional composure had cracked into barely controlled panic. She made 3 phone calls to Sandra Vance, her corporate lawyer, each conversation growing more heated. The residents watched the inspection with a mixture of vindication and anxiety. Robert had warned them this might happen, but seeing it unfold in real time felt surreal. Margaret found Robert in the common area, watching from his usual corner seat. "You did this?" she said quietly. "It wasn't a question." "I filed complaints," Robert admitted, "detailed ones. With documentation, the state had to respond. Patricia knows it was you. She suspects, but she can't prove it. Anonymous complaints are anonymous." Robert paused, though I imagined she have her theories. What neither of them knew was that Robert hadn't filed alone. The same week, Robert submitted his complaints to the State Licensing Board. A second set of complaints had been filed. These came from a law firm in Seattle Westfield and associates representing an unnamed client concerned about conditions at Sterling Grove. The complaints were filed by different people, from different angles, but they corroborated each other perfectly. The state had received a pattern too consistent to ignore. By mid-afternoon, Catherine Moore called an emergency meeting with all residents in the dining hall. Patricia attempted to attend, but was politely informed this was between the state and the residents. Catherine stood before them, her expression serious, but not unkind. "I want to be transparent with all of you about what we've found today," she began. "This facility is currently in violation of multiple health and safety codes. Some of these violations pose immediate risks to your well-being. Others represent long-term negligence that has gone unaddressed despite staff reporting these issues." The room was silent except for the hum of the defective HVAC system. "What happens now?" Walter asked. "Several things. First, Sterling Grove will be placed on immediate probationary status. They have 30 days to correct all immediate safety violations or face license suspension. Second, we'll be conducting interviews with residents who wish to provide testimony about their experiences here. These interviews are voluntary and confidential. Third, we're mandating an independent financial audit to determine if there are discrepancies between fees charged and services provided." "Will we have to leave?" someone asked, voice trembling. "Not immediately. But I'll be honest with you, based on what we've found today, there's a real possibility this facility could face temporary closure for renovations, or permanent closure if violations aren't corrected. If that happens, the state will work with you to find alternative placement. No one will be left without options." After Catherine finished, residents began lining up to request private interviews. Stories that had been whispered in hallways were now being spoken aloud to people with the power to act on them. Robert watched, feeling the weight of what he'd set in motion. This was what he'd wanted: accountability, exposure, change. But he also understood that change was chaotic, and chaos was hardest on people who'd already lost so much stability. James found him after the meeting. "You should know," James said quietly. "Patricia's looking for you, and she's not looking to thank you." "I expected that. Also, that visitor log you asked me to check? I found something. The Karagunga he's been signing in under different names. Fake names: John Smith, Robert Johnson. Generic stuff that wouldn't trigger attention. But 3 weeks ago, he sleeped up, signed him with initials instead of a full name." T.W. Robert's eyes sharpened. "T.W. mean anything to you?" Before Robert could answer, Patricia appeared in the hallway, her professional mask completely abandoned now. Behind her, Sandra Vance and another lawyer carried briefcases that suggested emergency legal measures. "Mr. Chun," Patricia said, her voice tight with controlled fury, "I need to speak with you. Now. Anything you need to say to me can be said here," Robert replied calmly. "Fine." Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You think you've won something today? You think bringing the state down on us makes you a hero? But here's what's going to happen. We're expediting your eviction. Not in 2 weeks, in 72 hours. And we're pursuing legal action against you for defamation, harassment, and conspiracy to damage Sterling Grove's reputation." Sandra stepped forward. "Mr. Chun, you've made serious accusations based on selectively documented evidence. You've coordinated with staff members to undermine management. You've organized residents to participate in actions against their own interests. These are actionable offenses." Robert looked at both women calmly. "You're welcome to pursue whatever legal action you'd like, but I'd suggest you focus your energy on the 30-day deadline you just received from the state. Because if you don't fix those violations, there won't be a Sterling Grove left to defend." Patricia's face flushed. "You smug, arrogant Patricia." A voice from behind them, quiet, but carrying absolute authority. Everyone turned. The man in the grey cardigan stood at the end of the hallway, but something about him had changed. The slouch was gone. The diffident, forgettable quality had vanished. He stood straight, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Who the hell are you?" Patricia demanded. The man walked toward them, with measured steps. When he reached the group, he looked directly at Patricia, and for the first time in months, he smiled. "My name," he said clearly, "is Thomas Westfield, and I believe we need to have a conversation about who actually owns this building." The name Thomas Westfield landed in the hallway like a grenade with a pin already pulled. Patricia's face went through a rapid series of calculations: confusion, recognition, denial, and finally, creeping dread. Sandra Vance's expression shifted from aggressive confidence to careful recalibration. She knew that name. Everyone in commercial real estate knew that name. Thomas Westfield was a legend in property development, a billionaire who'd built his empire on retirement communities, medical facilities, and senior housing across the Pacific Northwest. He owned 17 properties through a complex web of holding companies and investment groups, including, if the rumors were true, the parent company that managed Sterling Grove. "Mr. Westfield," Sandra said carefully, her legal instincts overriding her initial shock, I wasn't aware you were conducting site visits. If you'd notified our office, we could have arranged a proper tour. I don't conduct proper tours. Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. I conduct anonymous observations. I like to see how my properties actually operate when management doesn't know I'm watching. What I've seen here over the past 3 months has been illuminating. Patricia found her voice, though it came out higher than usual. Sir, if there have been concerns, our office is always open to feedback from ownership. We maintain detailed reports, performance metrics. I've read your reports, Thomas said. They're very impressive. They're also completely disconnected from reality. According to your documentation, this facility operates at 94% satisfaction with 0 major maintenance issues. According to what I've witnessed and what the state has now confirmed, you rerunning a structurally compromised building with systematic care violations while charging premium rates. He turned to Robert, who had been watching this exchange with careful attention. Mr. Chun, Thomas said, extending his hand. I believe we've been working on the same project from different angles. Robert shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of someone who still built things despite no longer needing to. Mr. Westfield, I've seen you watching, and I've seen you very thorough work, by the way. Your engineering background shows in the precision of your observations. Patricia's eyes widened. Engineering background? Thomas smiled slightly. You didn't know? Robert Chun was one of the most respected structural engineers in the Pacific Northwest for 30 years. He designed the Morrison Bridge retrofit, the Hawthorne Bridge seismic upgrades, and consulted on half the major buildings in downtown Portland. The man knows more about building systems than your entire maintenance department combined. Robert felt the familiar discomfort of being seen after years of invisibility. That was a long time ago. Skills like that don't expire, Thomas replied. He turned back to Patricia and Sandra. Which is why when Mr. Chun started documenting violations, I paid attention. Because when an engineer tells you a building is being mismanaged, you listen. And when I verified his observations through my own investigation, I knew we had a serious problem. Sandra was already on her phone, likely calling her senior partners. Patricia looked like she was considering various escape routes. I don't understand. Patricia sighed, her voice shaking slightly. If you've been concerned about operations here, why not simply contact us directly? Why the anonymous observation? Why allow it to escalate to a state inspection? Thomas's expression hardened, because I wanted to see how you'd respond to a resident raising legitimate concerns. I wanted to see if you'd address the problems, or try to silence the person pointing them out. You chose silence. You chose intimidation. You threatened eviction of a man who was documenting safety violations that could have killed people. We were following our protocols for disruptive residents. He wasn't disruptive. He was right. There's a difference. Thomas paused. But this conversation isn't about blame. It's about what happens next. As of today, Meridian Properties Group no longer manages this facility. I'm terminating the contract immediately. Sandra stepped forward. Mr. Westfield, with respect, terminating a management contract requires 90 days notice, according to the moral turpitude clause in Section 12 of our agreement. I can terminate immediately if management is found to be engaging in practices that endanger residents or expose the property to significant legal liability. I'd say systematic safety violations and elder abuse qualify. Thomas pulled out his phone, pulled up a document. My lawyers have already drafted the termination notice. It's being filed as we speak. Patricia's professional composure finally shattered completely. You can't do this. We have contracts with staff, with vendors, with residents. Those contracts will be honored by the new management company I'm installing. Your staff will keep their jobs if they choose to stay. Your vendors will be paid. The residents will experience a transition in leadership, not a disruption in care. The only people losing their positions are you and your administrative team. The hallway had filled with people now. Residents who'd heard the commotion, staff members who'd been listening from doorways. James stood near the back, his expression a mixture of shock and vindication. Margaret Holloway stepped forward, her professor's instincts recognizing a teachable moment. Mr. Chun, she said, her voice carrying through the hallway. We've known you for 5 years. You've been here since 2020. But we never knew who you were before what happened. How does someone go from designing bridges to living in a retirement community most of us can barely afford? Robert hesitated. This was the story he'd spent 5 years avoiding. The past he'd buried under routines and invisibility. But Thomas was watching him with an expression that suggested he already knew the answer. And the residents deserved to understand why he'd fought so hard for a place that had tried to break him. My wife Linda died in 2020. Robert began quietly. Cancer. Very fast. Very aggressive. We'd been married 41 years. She was an architect. We met on a job site in 1979. She was designing the building. I was engineering the structural systems. We spent our careers building things together. The hallway went silent. After she died, I couldn't work. Couldn't focus. Depression, the doctors called it, though that word feels too clinical for what it actually was. I stopped taking contracts. Stopped answering calls. My reputation sustained me for a while, but eventually the work dried up because I wasn't reliable anymore. He paused, looking at the photograph he still carried in his pocket. Linda, at the bridge opening, her hand on his chest. I sold our house because it was too full of her. Gave away most of our things because I didn't want to remember. I lived very simply for a few years, trying to figure out how to exist in a world that didn't include her. When I turned 70, I realized I needed some structure, some community, so I moved here. But your skills, Walter said, you still had them. You could have gone back to work, made the money to afford somewhere better. I didn't want somewhere better, Robert interrupted gently. I wanted somewhere quiet, where I could disappear. Sterling Grove offered that. Or at least, it claimed to. What I found instead was a system designed to make people feel invisible without their consent. And I realized I could choose invisibility, or I could choose to be seen. But watching them make you all invisible, that I couldn't accept. Thomas stepped forward. I came here 3 months ago, for different reasons. My wife Catherine died 18 months ago. Also cancer. Also fast. We'd been married 39 years. She ran the charitable foundation that oversees community welfare programs for all my properties. The parallel hit the hallway like a wave. After she died, I did what you did, Robert. I withdrew. Let other people run my companies while I tried to figure out how to be a person instead of a husband. But Catherine always insisted I see my properties as communities, not investments. She'd conduct surprise visits, talk to residents, make sure the people we housed were actually being cared for. He looked around at the residents, his expression softening. I came here to honor that, to see what she would have seen. And what I saw was you, Mr. Chun, fighting the same fight Catherine would have fought, documenting the same violations she would have documented, refusing to accept that profit justifies cruelty. Thomas turned to Patricia one final time. So here's what happens next. You and your administrative team have 24 hours to clear your offices. Severance will be paid according to your contracts, but your employment with any Westfield property is permanently terminated. Ms. Vance, your firm's retainer is also terminated. Any legal action against Mr. Chun, or any resident who participated in filing complaints, will be considered harassment. And I'll make sure you spend more on defense than you could possibly gain. Patricia opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking with less confidence than they had that morning. Sandra followed, already on her phone, already calculating damage control. The hallway remained frozen for a long moment. Then James started clapping, slowly at first, then joined by Maria, by Carol, by other staff members who'd spent years watching Injustice Compound daily. The residents joined in, and suddenly the hallway filled with applause, not triumphant, but relieved. The sound of people who had been holding their breath for years, finally exhaling. Robert stood quietly, uncomfortable with the attention, until Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. You did this? Thomas said quietly, meant only for Robert. I provided resources, but you provided the courage. You started documenting when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I just couldn't watch anymore, Robert replied. I spent my career building things that would last, that would keep people safe. Watching this place crumble while pretending it was solid, it went against everything I'd ever believed. Thomas nodded. Then help me fix it. Properly. I'm installing new management, but I need someone who actually understands this building, who knows the residents, who can identify what genuine care looks like. Work with me. Consult. Make sure Sterling Grove becomes what it claimed to be. Robert looked at him, surprised. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a purpose and a salary, yes. But mostly I'm asking you to do what you've been doing, just with resources and authority behind you, instead of threats of eviction. For the first time in years, Robert felt something shift. Not happiness, it was too soon for that, but possibility. I'll consider it, he said. Thomas smiled. That's all I ask. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret approached Robert again. You've never told us, she said. All this time, we thought you were just another forgotten person. But you've built bridges. Robert shook his head gently. I am just another forgotten person, Margaret. The bridges don't change that. What changed is deciding that being forgotten doesn't mean accepting being erased. She smiled. The literature professor in me appreciates that distinction. And in that moment, standing in a hallway that had witnessed so much quiet suffering, Robert Chun felt himself becoming visible again, not because of what he'd built in the past, but because of what he'd fought for in the present. That evening, Thomas Westfield sat in Sterling Grove's small administrative office soon, to be gutted and rebuilt, reviewing files that Patricia had left behind in her hurried departure. Robert sat across from him, both men working in the comfortable silence of people who understood that some conversations required context before words. Outside, the November rain drummed against windows. Inside, the building felt different. Lighter somehow, as if the departure of systematic cruelty had improved the air quality. Thomas finally looked up from a particularly damning financial spreadsheet. "I need to tell you the complete truth," he said, "about why I was really here." Robert set down the maintenance log he'd been cross-referencing. "I assumed you were conducting oversight of your properties. That's partly true, but it's not the whole story." Thomas leaned back, his expression carrying the weight of grief that Robert recognized intimately. "Catherine, my wife, she didn't just run our charitable foundation. She designed our entire approach to senior housing. She insisted that every property we built had to serve the residents first, profit second. It was her non-negotiable principle." He pulled out his phone, showed Robert a photograph. A woman in her mid-60s, silver hair, bright eyes, standing in front of a building ribbon-cutting ceremony. She was brilliant, an MBA from Stanford, could have made billions in traditional real estate, but she chose to focus on senior care because her own mother had been warehoused in a facility that treated her like a burden. Catherine swore she'd never let that happen to anyone else if she had the power to prevent it. Robert studied the photograph. "She looks like someone who didn't accept excuses." She didn't, which is why, 3 years ago, she started hearing rumors about Sterling Grove. Nothing concrete, just whispers from industry contacts that this property wasn't operating according to our standards. She wanted to investigate, but I dismissed it. Told her we had management oversight, corporate audits, systems in place. Thomas's voice tightened. 6 months before she died, she made me promise something. She was in the hospital, knew the cancer was winning, and she grabbed my hand and said, "Thomas, go to Sterling Grove yourself. Don't send auditors. Don't trust reports. Go there as a nobody and see what actually happens to people when we're not watching." The rain intensified outside, creating a rhythm against the silence. I promised I would. Tensa Diaz and I spent a year unable to do anything except exist. You understand that state? Robert nodded. Though, but promises to dying wives have a particular weight. So, 3 months ago, I finally came here. Dressed like a retiree, drove a regular car instead of having my driver drop me off. Paid for coffee with exact change. I became invisible, and you saw what she suspected. Worse, I saw systematic negligence masquerading as efficiency. I saw financial manipulation designed to extract maximum profit from vulnerable people. I saw staff who wanted to provide good care being prevented from doing so by policies that prioritize spreadsheets over human beings. Thomas stood, walked to the window, watched the rain. But here's the part I'm ashamed of. I saw all of that. Documented it, had my lawyers building a case, and I was still planning to handle it quietly. Corporate restructuring, management changes, internal reforms, no public exposure, no state involvement. Just clean it up behind closed doors and move on. What changed? Robert asked. You did? Thomas turned to face him. I watched you help Walter Kovac. I watched Patricia reprimand you for basic human decency, and I watched you refuse to be silenced. You had nothing, no money, no power, no la virijan. You still fought. You started documenting, not because you thought you'd win, but because you couldn't accept staying silent. He returned to his chair. That's when I realized Catherine would have been furious with me. She wouldn't have wanted quiet corporate reforms. She would have wanted accountability, transparency, public exposure that prevented this from happening at any of our properties. So I changed tactics. You filed the complaints that triggered the state inspection, Robert said. It wasn't a question. My lawyers did, yes, using different documentation than yours, from different angles. When the state received complaints from multiple sources that corroborated each other perfectly, they had to act. I made sure of that. Robert processed this. You could have simply fired Patricia yourself, changed management without all this drama. I could have, but that would have protected the system that enabled her. By involving the state, by creating public record of violations, I ensured that every property in my portfolio, 17 facilities housing over 2,000 seniors, would face increased scrutiny. I turned Sterling Grove into an example, a warning. Thomas met Robert's eyes directly. I used you, in a sense. I saw what you were building, and I amplified it. I'm not proud of the manipulation, but I'm not apologetic either. Because together, we accomplished something neither of us could have done alone. The admission hung between them. Robert considered feeling angry, feeling used, but mostly he felt a strange sense of alignment to men who'd lost their wives, who'd found purpose in fighting the same injustice from different positions of power. Catherine would have liked you, Thomas continued. She had a rule about people. She said you could judge someone's character by what they do when they have no power and no audience. You had neither, and you still fought. That's rare. I didn't fight for noble reasons, Robert said quietly. I fought because I was angry, because watching people be erased reminded me of erasing myself after Linda died. It wasn't heroism, it was projection. Motivation doesn't invalidate impact. You save lives here, Robert. Walter Kovac's cardiac episode happened because this building's emergency response protocols had degraded to nothing. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't stayed with him, he'd be dead. That matters more than why you did. Robert looked down at his engineer's hands, still steady despite age, still capable of building. What happens now? He asked. Thomas pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. This is the proposal I'm offering you. Title: Director of Resident Advocacy and Facility Standards. Salary commensurate with your experience. Your job would be to do exactly what you've been doing. Document, ensure our facilities actually serve the people living in them, but with authority, resources, and my complete support. Robert opened the folder, scanned the contract. The salary was generous. The scope was comprehensive. The authority was real. You want me to be your wife's conscience? He said. Thomas smiled sadly. I want you to be what she would have been if she'd lived. Someone who refuses to let profit excuse cruelty. Someone who remembers that buildings aren't investments, they're homes for people who deserve dignity. In Sterling Grove, new management arrives Monday. Karen Toreshi ran our Seattle property for 12 years, with 0 violations and 98% satisfaction. She's expensive, competent, and incapable of tolerating bullshit. She'll report to you as much as to corporate. Your job is to make sure this place becomes what we promised it would be. Robert sat with the offer, feeling the weight of purpose after years of I'll need to interview the staff, he said finally. James, Maria Carol, they risked their jobs to provide documentation. They deserve protection and promotion, not just gratitude. Agreed. Write up your recommendations. And the residents who participated in the class action, they'll be afraid of retaliation even with you in charge. We need explicit protections written into policy. Also agreed. What else? Robert looked met Thomas's eyes. I need you to understand that if I take this position, I won't be loyal to your bottom line. I'll be loyal to the residents. If that creates conflict with profit margins, then we adjust the profit margins, Thomas interrupted. Catherine built this company on the principle that doing right by people is profitable in the long term. Facilities with happy residents have waiting lists. Facilities with good staff retention provide better care. Facilities that don't face lawsuits save millions in legal fees. Treating people well isn't charity, it's good business. He paused. But even if it wasn't good business, I'd still do it. Because I made a promise to a dying woman, and I've already broken it once by waiting too long. I won't break it again. Robert closed the folder, but didn't slide it back. I need to think about it, he said. This is a significant commitment. Take the time you need, but Robert, don't let fear of purpose keep you from accepting it. You've been invisible long enough. Catherine saw value in visibility, in using whatever power you have to protect people who have none. I think Linda would have agreed with that philosophy. The use of his wife's name, spoken with respect rather than manipulation, hit Robert harder than expected. How do you know Linda would have agreed? Thomas smiled gently. Because she married a man who spent his career building bridges, little structures designed to connect people, to carry them safely from one place to another. That's not the work of someone who believes in isolation. That's the work of someone who believes in connection, in service, in making the world more navigable for everyone. He stood, extended his hand. Think about it. But while you're thinking, know that what you built here matters. The documentation, the courage, the refusal to accept that cruelty has inevitably changed everything. Not just for Sterling Grove, but for every property I own. You reminded me what Catherine always knew. That someone has to be watching. Someone has to care enough to fight. Robert shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of shared purpose. After Thomas left, Robert sat alone in the office, holding the folder, thinking about bridges and wives, and the difference between being forgotten and choosing invisibility. Outside, The rain continued. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, Robert Chun began imagining a future that extended beyond simple survival. He pulled out his phone, looked at the photograph of Linda at the bridge opening. "What do you think?" he asked the image quietly. "Do I build again?" The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but he could imagine what she'd say. Linda had never believed in wasting skills out of grief. She'd always believed that building was a form of love, creating things that would outlast you, that would serve people you'd never meet. Robert opened his notebook, turned to a fresh page, and began writing. Not documentation this time. Plans. 6 months later, Sterling Grove Retirement Community looked almost the same from the outside. The same brick facade, the same landscaped entrance, the same sign that promised the exceptional senior living in a caring community. But everything beneath the surface had, fundamentally, changed. The West Wing had been completely renovated, walls rebuilt, water damage eliminated, structural integrity restored. James had supervised the work personally, finally able to fix what he'd documented for years. The HVAC system had been replaced entirely. Fire exits were clear. Safety codes weren't just met, they were exceeded. But the physical changes were the least significant transformation. In the dining hall, residents now sat on a food services committee that approved menus, portion sizes, and quality standards. Carol ran the kitchen with a budget that allowed her to serve actual nutrition instead of creative reheating. Meals were prepared with care, not efficiency. In the common areas, residents had established a grievance board, elected representatives who met monthly with management to address concerns before they became crises. Margaret Holloway chaired it, bringing her professor's rigor to holding leadership accountable. The staff had changed, too. Maria was now head of environmental services, overseeing a team that maintained the building with pride rather than apology. Marcus Green, the former security guard, had been let go, replaced by 2 part-time staff who actually cared about resident safety. And James had been promoted to Director of Facilities Management, finally earning a salary that reflected his expertise and his daughter's college tuition. Keran Torres, the new administrator, ran Sterling Grove with the kind of competent compassion that made Patricia Aldrich's tenure feel like a fever dream. She knew every resident by name. She attended community meals. She responded to concerns within 24 hours, and she reported directly to Robert Chun, who reviewed her decisions with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that neglect compounded in silence. Robert's role had evolved beyond anyone's initial expectations. As Director of Resident Advocacy and Facility Standards, he split his time between Sterling Grove and Thomas Westfield's 16 other properties, conducting the same anonymous observations that had exposed the rot here. He dressed in his navy cardigan, sat in corners with newspapers, and watched how staff treated residents when they thought no one in port was looking. He'd identified problems at 3 other facilities, nothing as severe as Sterling Grove, but patterns of decline that would become severe if left unchecked. Management had been restructured, standards had been reinforced, and residents at those facilities had been taught what Robert had learned. That advocacy wasn't rebellion, it was responsibility. But Sterling Grove remained his home base, the place where he'd rediscovered that invisibility was a choice, not a sentence. On a Thursday afternoon, in late April, Robert sat in the community room reviewing inspection reports when Thomas Westfield arrived unannounced, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the good cafe across the street. "Thought you might need better coffee than what this place serves," Thomas said, settling into the chair across from him. Robert accepted the cup with a slight smile. "Karen's working on that. She's meeting with new vendors next week." "Good. How are the numbers looking?" Robert slid over a spreadsheet. "Occupancy is at 98%, with a waiting list of 47 people. Staff retention is up 63% from last year. Resident satisfaction surveys show 90% would recommend Sterling Grove to others. And we're operating at a 12% profit margin, lower than under Patricia, but sustainable and ethical." Thomas reviewed the numbers with satisfaction. Catherine would have approved of this balance. "There's something else," Robert said, pulling out another document. "I want to propose a new program. A mentorship system where residents with professional teachers, nurses, accountants volunteer to consult with local nonprofits in schools, use their skills, give them purpose, remind the community that age doesn't erase Thomas read through the proposal, nodding slowly. "This goes beyond facility management. It does, but Sterling Grove shouldn't just be a place where people wait to die. It should be a place where they continue to contribute, to matter, to be seen as resources rather than expenses." "How much will it cost?" "Minimal overhead, mainly coordination and transportation. But the return isn't financial. It's dignity. It's proving that residents here still have value beyond their monthly fees." Thomas signed the approval form without hesitation. "Implement it, and if it works here, We'll expand it to the other properties. They sat in comfortable silence, watching through the window as residents moved through their day. Walter Kovac walked past, healthier now, laughing with David Ramos about something. Margaret Holloway sat in the garden reading to a small group, her literature professor's skills finding new audience. "I've been thinking about something," Thomas said quietly, "about why this matters so much to both of us. It's not just about Catherine and Linda, though they're part of it. What is it about?" "Fear," Thomas replied. "We're both aging. We both know that eventually we'll be the ones needing care. And what we're really doing here are the reforms, the oversight, the advocacy we're building the world we hope exists when we need it." Robert considered this. "You're right. I don't want to end up in a place like Sterling Grove as none of us do. So we're creating the alternative. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't documented everything? If you'd just accepted the situation?" "Every day," Robert admitted, "Walter would probably be dead. Margaret would still be isolated. James would still be complicit in violations he knew were wrong. And I'd still be invisible, not by choice but by force." He paused. "But I also think about what would have happened if you hadn't been watching, if you'd handled this quietly through corporate channels. The state inspection, the public accountability, the example it set that changed the entire industry's awareness. Other facilities know they're being watched now. That matters." Thomas nodded. "We needed each other. Your documentation gave me moral imperative. My resources gave your documentation teeth. Together, we built something neither of us could have built alone." "Like a bridge," Robert said with a slight smile. "Multiple support structures, different materials, but all working toward the same purpose, getting people safely from one place to another. I like that metaphor. Though in this case, we're helping people stay in place with dignity rather than forcing them to move." A knock interrupted them. James stood in the doorway. "Mr. Chun, sorry to interrupt. There's someone here to see you. Says it's personal." Robert followed James to the lobby, and stopped. A woman in her 30s stood there, professional attire carrying a portfolio. She had her mother's eyes. "Mr. Chun, I'm Emma Mercer, James's daughter. I'm in my final semester of civil engineering at Portland State, and I'm doing my thesis on structural integrity assessments in aging buildings. My father told me about your work here, about your background. I was hoping you might be willing to be interviewed for my research." Robert looked at James, who stood nearby with barely contained pride. "Your father is a remarkable man," Robert said to Emma. "He documented violations for 15 years, waiting for someone to have the courage to act on them. He's the real hero of this story." Emma smiled. "He says the same thing about you, that you taught him that documentation without action is just organized silence." Robert gestured toward the community room. "I'd be happy to help with your thesis, but on one condition: you have to let me introduce you to some of the other residents. Former professors, architects, civil planners, people who've built this city and are still here, still sharp, still valuable." "I'd love that," Emma said. As Robert walked her toward the community room, introducing her to Margaret and Walter and others whose expertise had been dormant for years, he felt something click into place. This was the purpose he'd been searching for. Not just fixing Sterling Grove, but building a bridge between generations. Showing young engineers like Emma that the old people they'd one day become were unburdens, they were resources. Wisdom. Living history. That evening, Robert stood on his small balcony, watching the sun set over Portland. The bridges he'd helped build decades ago glowed in the fading light: the Morrison, the Hawthorne, the Burnside. Structures that would outlive him, carrying thousands of people daily across water that would have stopped them otherwise. He pulled out his phone, looked at Linda's photograph one more time. "I built again," he told her image quietly. "Not a bridge this time. Something smaller, but maybe something that matters more." His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Board meeting next month. Want you to present the mentorship program to all 17 properties. Prepare to defend your budget." Robert smiled. Defending budgets for human dignity. This was the fight worth having. It texted back, "I'll be ready." Below, in the parking lot, he noticed a car he didn't recognize. Someone sitting inside, watching the building. For a moment, he tensed old habits from months of being surveilled by Patricia's staff. Then he relaxed. Let them watch. Sterling Grove had nothing to hide anymore. If anything, observers would see a facility operating exactly as it promised, caring for people with competence and compassion. And if they didn't see that, if they saw violations or negligence or cruelty, Robert wanted to know, because the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Justice wasn't a destination. It was maintenance. Constant, careful attention to ensure that systems designed to serve people didn't decay into systems designed to exploit them. Robert went inside, sat at his desk, and began drafting his presentation for the board meeting. The apartment light glowed softly until well past midnight, visible from the street below, a beacon of someone still building, still watching, still refusing to accept that powerlessness was inevitable. And in 17 facilities across 3 states, residents slept a little safer knowing that many someones were paying attention. Not because they had to, because they'd learned that being seen and seeing others was the only antidote to the kind of invisibility that allowed injustice to flourish. The story of Sterling Grove would be told quietly in industry meetings, in regulatory discussions, in the careful reforms that spread through senior care facilities, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. But the real story, the one that mattered, was simpler. An old man had decided he mattered. A billionaire had decided to honor his wife's principles. A maintenance worker had decided documentation demanded action. And together, they'd proven that injustice only prospers when everyone assumes no one important is watching. They'd been wrong about that. Someone was always watching, and sometimes that someone had the power to turn observation into accountability, to turn silence into change, to turn invisibility into the kind of visibility that protected rather than exposed. Robert Chun closed his laptop, turned off his light, and went to bed. Tomorrow, there would be more work, more facilities to visit, more residents to advocate for, more systems to scrutinize. But tonight, he rested knowing that the bridges he'd built in his career had carried people across water, and the advocacy he'd built in his retirement was carrying people toward dignity. Both were forms of engineering. Both were forms of love. Both were proof that building never really stops, it just changes form as we age. The real question was never whether we had the power to build. It was whether we had the courage to use whatever power we possessed, no matter how small, to create something better than what we'd inherited. Robert Chun had answered that question, and in doing so, he'd reminded everyone watching that invisible didn't mean powerless. It just meant underestimated. And sometimes, being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. This story ended because someone was paying attention, but there are countless places where no one is. If you want to hear the next story, the one where injustice hasn't been exposed yet, subscribe. Because the most dangerous systems aren't the ones built on cruelty. They're the ones built on silence.